You, Chris. Now, I'm not a choir director, so I can't lead you in a song like my friend just left here. So I'm going to have to tell you about my experience in the war. I landed on Omaha Beach, and we took every little village from there to Paris. And I was under General George Patton. If you've studied World War II history, I'm sure you're familiar with General George Patton. He was one of our good generals. And when we got to Paris, the Germans loved to come to Paris for vacations. And we had set up on the west side of it to liberate Paris. And if we had, we would have thrown artillery in there and we would have torn the town up. Terrible, the whole village of Paris. And so the Germans withdrew and we didn't have to fight in the city of Paris. The only thing was there was a few snipers, and the Free French come in and took care of all those snipers. We didn't do any fighting in Paris itself. But they did want to set up a review stand on Champs-Élysées Boulevard. And for one of you that have been to Paris, that's the main street that runs from the Arc de Triomphe down to Notre Dame Church. And General Eisenhower and General Patton and General de Gaulle and all of the big generals were there in the reviewing stand. And we marched 24 abreast from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre Dame Church. It's a famous picture. If you ever go to New Orleans to the World War II Museum, they've got a tremendous big picture of that in that museum. And it was one of the famous pictures that was put in Life magazine during World War II, and I believe in the 20, it's right after D-Day there at 44, and but it was big. They wanted to show the world that the biggest city in Europe was liberated, so why they put that in there. And then I went with General Hodges, First Army, on through the northern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Now I've just went back this year to the 75th anniversary of D-Day landing, and I was telling some of the group was in here a little bit ago that we visited all 5 of the beaches. Of course, each one of the beaches has a museum, and at that museum they have some stuff that was taking place there D-Day in 44. And so when I was at Paris there when I went back to visit, the first group that wanted to interview me was a photographer and a reporter. And I asked him who was he with and where was he from? And he said he was from Berlin. And it kind of surprised me that Berlin was the first one that wanted to interview us, and he did. And they contacted me later and said that they really enjoyed that interview, and it was one of the best ones they had received there. I don't know how many they did. But I was telling some of the other bunch that was here, I imagine 1,000 French people come up and shook my hand, and they sincerely meant what they were saying. They thanked me for what we did 75 years ago. Now, 60% of those people wasn't 75-year-old, so their parents or their grandparents told them what happened 75 years ago. You know, when the enemy moved in there, they took all of their furniture, all their money, all their cars, all their food, and those people had no food for 4 years because they took all that food and gave it to their soldiers. So they really suffered for 4 years, and you can understand why they were so thankful when we would come through and liberate them. And they would give you anything they had. They didn't have much. They'd take a little, we call them a penny matchbox top, and give it to you because you'd liberate their little village. And they were all sincere. They just, thousands of them. And about 7 years ago, a gentleman from Luxembourg wrote me a letter and said that he had looked me up and he knew I fought in Luxembourg, and he wondered if I would write him back and tell him the cities that I fought in that he would like to run some research on them. And I asked him what did he want with it, and he said that he was in contact with about 20 World War II veterans, and he wanted their statements on those cities and wanted a picture. He wanted to put it in one of the rooms in his house. And then he invited all of the school children in Luxembourg City to come, and he was trying to keep the history up of what happened to Luxembourg during that time. So I sent him all that stuff. I never met him. His name is Patrick Dex. And we were at Omaha Beach. There's a museum at each one of the beaches. And as I said, there's thousands of people trying to shake your hand. And I was in that museum, and I was sitting on a bench. There was a gentleman sitting right next to me, and they were all over me here and all down through there. But there was one hole here, and a gentleman come in and sat down, and I took his hand and introduced myself to him, and he said he was from Hungary. And then I turned around to shake hands with this gentleman that was sitting right next to me, and he says, you don't need to introduce yourself to me. I know who you are. And I said, how you know that? He said, I'm Patrick Dix. And that's a guy I've been writing to for 5 or 6 years. And I don't know how he knew that I was there, but he come and sat right down beside me. And that's the first time I ever saw him. And things like that happen over there. Those people are so thankful for what you did that they just go out of their way to thank you and do what they can. And so we went back to Europe in September to where I fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And we went through the areas where we all fought. And I had a historian to contact me and wanted to know if I had any free time. If I did, they'd like to come and take me back to the Hurtgen Forest where we fought. That's part of the Battle of the Bulge. And so I found out that Wednesday was pretty free. So he and a gentleman from England come and took me to the Hurtgen Forest where we had a terrible battle. And there's the area right there exactly where I fought 75 years ago. And there's a foxhole there. A foxhole is a hole in the ground that you dig to keep shrapnel from hitting you when artillery goes off, or keep somebody from shooting you with a small arm rifle. And that foxhole has about 1.5 feet of leaves in it, and it's weathered around the top, but it's still there 75 years from ago when I dug it. And it's amazing that that Hurtgen Forest is a beautiful forest. And when we first went in there to fight, the trees are lined up just like the graveyards are lined up, and the ground is immaculate. And of course, artillery started coming in there, and it just destroyed all those trees, and they were bursting in the air, and the shrapnel on the trees were coming down. And then all the phosphorus shells they threw in there didn't hit the detonator, so they didn't explode. And later on in years, weather has destroyed the casing on those, and the phosphorus come out. And 50 years ago, it set that forest on fire, and it burned it. And then all those trees are there today when I went back are trees that are 35, 40 year old. And it's not as immaculate as it was 75 years ago, but it's started growing again. But it's amazing that you can go back to where you were 75 years ago and see that. Now, I also went back to Furin, Luxembourg. After we fought in the Hurricane Forest, my division is 20,000 men. We lost 9,000 men in that battle. So we were sent to Dunkirk, Luxembourg, brought back to strength. And that's just like here. There's nothing going on. It was pleasant. And from there, we were sent to Dunkirk. We were sent to Furin, Luxembourg, on the German border, a little village, just pleasant as it could be. And we were there for, imagine, a week. And our supply was down in the town below it called Walls. And our kitchen was down there. So it was so pleasant that I told the first sergeant, I said, Batter's my friend. I'm going to go down and visit him. He was a supply sergeant. So I went down on the day of the 15th of December, 1944, and spent the night with Batter in the kitchen. They cooked us a steak and a baked potato, and we all had a little party there. And we were behind John's house. I don't know what John's last name is, but he lived there in Furin, in Walls. And we went to bed in the little barn that he had. And the next morning at 5 o'clock, I was awakened with rockets and artillery just coming in all around that little old barn. And they were preparing the breakfast for the troops up in Furin. So I told Batter, I said, I got to get up there. Things are popping and they need me. So when the Jeep took the pancakes and the sausage and the syrup up to the troops, I went with them. And when I got up there, this little village we in is, it's not a big village. It's just, I'd say maybe 30, 40 houses. But the house where our headquarters was is owned by a kind of a bed and breakfast. It's a 3-story house, and our headquarters was on the 2nd floor. The weather's so severe there that they don't put any doors and windows in the north end of the house. So the east, the west, and the south has windows and doors in it. And so when I got up there, the German 5th Panzer Division was coming around the left flank, and 373rd Vanguard coming around the right flank. And there's 200 of us in that little village. And when we seen that many enemy was coming, we pulled all those troops back into the Betzer house because we could defend everything but the north end of it. And we did that. The 15th, the 16th, the 17th, our Jeep was running ammunition back to us. And then on the 17th, they moved the Tiger tanks in there, and they knocked out our Jeeps. And our Jeeps was bringing ammunition to us. So we tried to get somebody to bring us ammunition, and nobody could get to us. Nobody could help us. So the next day, the 18th, there was a little tank down in the city of Walls. So we asked for it to bring us ammunition. So it come up and got into the town where we were, but there was so many Germans in the town that they turned around and started back down the hill, and one of those Tiger tanks knocked him out. So there was no way that we could get any ammunition. And the night of the 18th, I heard something hit the house, and I went back there to see what it was, and they put another round in there. It was a bazooka. and they knocked a hole in the north end of the house, and then they turned a flamethrower in there and set it on fire. So we took inventory, and we had 6 rounds of ammunition. So there's no way you can fight 2 divisions with 6 rounds of ammunition. So I come back and reported this to the company commander, and he says, well, after he found out we only had 6 rounds, he said, call artillery and tell them to flatten the town in 30 minutes that I'm going to surrender the company. I said, well, that's pretty dangerous, isn't it? And he said, well, go ahead and do it. So I did that, and we surrendered the company, and we started moving out of the little town, and the artillery started coming in. And we walked till the next day, and we went to a little house where they were interviewing you and getting as much information as they could out of you. And the ones of us that was wounded, there was a German doctor there, and he was patching us up and putting paper patches on there and doing what he could for us. They took us to Steilager 4B. They fingerprinted us and photographed us, gave us dog tags, and then they segregated us. They took all the officers, put them in concentration camps. They took all the privates and put them in coal mines, work farms, or wherever they needed them to work. And all of the NCOs, they put on a march. It was about 800 or 900 of us. And they would start us towards Czechoslovakia, where there was a Steilager called 8A. And we walked for 9 months, all day, all night, a lot of times. A lot of times we would just walk at day. They'd put us in little old barns at night, and those farmers kept their rutabagas and sugar beets in those little old barns, and that's what they fed their stock. They didn't grow corn like we grow around here. They do now, but they didn't at that time. And they have choppers in that barn that they can chop that rutabaga or sugar beet up to where the cows can pick it up and their horses. So that we would steal one of those and eat it, and that's what we lived off of, which was very little. I imagine I weighed around 200 pounds when I started. I lost 70 pounds because I was only getting the energy from the rutabagas and the sugar beets. But we walked all the way to the Czechoslovakian border, and Russian artillery was coming in from the Eastern Front. And they had Slavs and British at that Steilager. So they didn't want the Germans to get us. They turned us around and started us back towards the American front. And we could hear Russian artillery coming in. And we'd traveled probably 5 or 6 days. And they'd put us in a barn lot behind a house in an area where there wasn't no military value at all to it. And we were there for the night, and the next morning, I heard a tank coming. There was 240 of us. Now, when we started marching, there was 800 or 900 of us. And the weather was terrible, snow this deep. And a lot of the guys we lost was froze to death. Some of them starved to death. But the majority of them had dysentery, and we lost them. And when they'd fall out, you'd never see them again. The rear echelon guards would shoot them, and the farmers would bury them. So that 500 or 600 men we lost in that march. If you had a bone detector and you knew the exact route that we marched, and you could pick up those bones, you would find probably 500 men through there that we lost. But when I heard that tank coming, I kept looking. I thought it was a tank. And then I could see that it was a half-track. A half-track is a vehicle got wheels on the front, but it's got tracks on the rear. And they use them for scout and patrol a lot of time. It belonged to the 2nd Armored. And there was a command car with it, which had radio equipment on it. And when it turned sideways, I saw the big white star on it. And we realized it was Americans. So by the time they got on down to where we were, we had taken over the guards and had them as prisoners. And they gave us what food they had on that half track, which was 2 gallons of beans and 1 gallon of carrots, which wasn't enough to feed 240 men. So the farmer had a little calf, and he had a bin of potatoes and a wash pot in the yard. So we got that calf, killed that calf and the potatoes and started making beef soup with potatoes in it to feed that people. The half-track called for trucks to come and get us. They moved us back to a little airport, and they were flying the British back to England. They were trucking the Americans back to La Havre, France. Now, as long as we were fighting, we never had no lice on us. But when we were prisoners, they had no pesticides, anything to keep the lice or any kind of insect off of you. So we just had those big old long lice on you all the time. And every time you'd stop, you'd take your clothes off and pick those lice out, put them back on, and you wouldn't go 2 or 3 hours, so you're scratching again. And there was a big old German colonel that I guess was in charge of us. He was always dressed up real clean, and his collar was kind of like our Marine veterans. When he leaned forward, it would give you a pretty big hole back there. And one time, he was sitting on the side of the road right where we marched, and his feet hanging off, and had his head down, and his collar was opened up. And I had just scratched good and had a whole lot of big old lice under my fingers. So when I got right to him, I just put them right down his back. And the next day or two, I noticed he's scratching just like we were. So I'm glad he got to enjoy some of them. But that was the way that we spent that time. And now this past September, I went back in June I went back to France and saw all the area where we fought and everything, all of the 5 of the beaches and all the museums. And then in September I went back to Europe, to Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. And then, as I told you, this historian took me out and showed me where I fought in the Hurricane Forest and in the foxhole that I dug 75 years ago. And then also they took me up to the Betzer house in Furin. And as I told you, we called for artillery. Elsie had a picture there of the house in rubble, just the wall. And I said, Elsie, what happened to your house? She said, the bombs tore it up. Well, the bombs didn't do it, the artillery tore it up. Because as I was telling you, the night that we surrendered the company commander asked us to call artillery. Artillery is 4 big guns, 240 millimeter guns. And we called them and told them to flatten the town. So that house really got those bombs, and it tore it completely down. She had pictures of it. And I didn't tell her that. I asked her, I said, what happened? She said, the bombs did it. Well, there wasn't no planes flying because the weather was too bad. They couldn't even get off the ground. But I didn't tell her that I called for that artillery, and that artillery did it. And but they've built the house back. It's in brick now, where it was in rock. And Chris, that's been talking to you on this mic, she was with us there, and she went back and she got to meet Elsie and Adolph. Now, Adolph's her brother, but he doesn't speak any English at all. But Elsie was an exchange student in Pennsylvania. So she speaks good English. Yes, sir. 5 minutes. Okay, I'll tell y'all one thing, and then I'll quit. When, as I told you, we got no food, they gave us no food. I had a buddy, Andy McLaughlin. I fought with him all the way across Europe. We were prisoners together. I told Andy, I said, now, Andy, we got to take chances. They'd shoot you if they caught you stealing a rutabaga or sugar beet, or they'd turn dogs on you. So one night they put us in a barn, and the barn was old, and the boards were kind of loose on it. There was 15 or 20 of us in one stall. There was a cow in the next stall. And you can imagine how hungry we were. So I kept fooling with that board, and I got the board off. And I got over there, and I never had milked a cow. And I thought you just got to hold that, and the milk run out of it, but that don't work that way. So I went back and got Andy, and I would hold my hands in the helmet, and Andy would milk in it. And we were so hungry that we'd get about that much milk in there, and we'd drink it. And we milked that cow all night long till daylight the next morning. We put that board back. The old farmer come out with his stool and a bucket, and he's talking to the cow. He starts trying to get his milk, and he wasn't getting no milk. So he started cursing her, and he went out and accused the guards of milking his cow. So we drank that milk, and we drank it all night long, and it was good. If anybody got a quick question, I'll answer it for you. Pardon?
Anybody have any questions?
Yes, sir. I'm hard hearing now. Talk loud. What did he say?
They couldn't eat the cow because they were prisoners in a barn. Anybody else?
Okay.
How did you overcome the guards? When the rescue group was coming, you said you made the Germans your prisoners. How did you do that?
What'd she say?
How did you overcome the guards when the Americans came in? How did you overtake the guards?
Oh, when we saw the half track coming, there was 6 or 7 of the guards. Of course, they had rifles, ammunition, and loaded. Well, there's 240 of us, so we just took the guns away from them, and they were our prisoners.
So, I would imagine with the Americans coming and knowing that you were going to have support, you could do that.
Well, they realized too that was an American vehicle, and they didn't know that there wasn't 1,000 Americans right behind it. So I'm sure they were ready to give up too, because they got their rations every 7 days. And one time we stole their rations one night, and we ate. They was in a barn, and we ate 7 days ration. All of us did. We'd go down and get it, and we didn't keep it. We just eat it, because if they caught you with it, they'd shoot you. And we done that twice.
So, one time somebody asked George, what was your best day? And you said, when you came home.
That's right.
And what was your biggest fear? And he said, hunger.
That's right.
So with everything going on, you know you're hungry when hunger is your biggest fear. So let's give him a hand. Thank you, George. And if you guys on your way out want to stop and shake his hand, go ahead.